In this episode, we're going to focus on one of the most important habits that separates trustworthy threat intelligence from confident guesswork, which is the discipline of evaluating where information came from and how strong it really is. New learners often assume that if a detail is written down in a report or repeated by multiple people, it must be solid. In reality, the same weak claim can be repeated many times, and a polished narrative can hide a lack of real evidence. Rating sources and evidence is not about being cynical or dismissive, and it is not about treating everything as unreliable. It is about building a consistent way to decide what you should trust, how much you should trust it, and what you still need before you can make a strong conclusion. When you do this well, your analysis becomes calmer because you are no longer trying to force certainty out of uncertainty. You are instead building a ladder of confidence one rung at a time. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful way to start is to separate two ideas that beginners often blend together: the reliability of a source and the credibility of a specific piece of information. A source is the origin of the information, such as an internal system, a sensor, a person, or an external report. Reliability is about how that source has performed over time, including whether it tends to be accurate, whether it tends to exaggerate, and whether it tends to provide verifiable details. Credibility of information is about whether this specific claim is well supported, consistent with other evidence, and plausible given what you know. A reliable source can still provide a wrong detail sometimes, and an unreliable source can occasionally point towards something true. When you keep those ideas distinct, you avoid overtrusting a claim just because you like the publisher, and you avoid dismissing a claim just because it came from a weaker channel. This separation is a cornerstone of disciplined evaluation. Now think about what makes a source more reliable, because you want your ratings to be based on observable qualities rather than feelings. A more reliable source tends to show its work, meaning it explains how it gathered information and provides enough detail that others could verify or challenge it. It also tends to be consistent over time, not in the sense that it is always right, but in the sense that its errors are rare and are corrected when found. Reliable sources also tend to distinguish observation from inference, which is a sign of analytic maturity. In contrast, weaker sources often rely on vague language, dramatic claims without artifacts, or conclusions that cannot be tested. Another warning sign is when a source makes many broad claims across many topics without clearly indicating where the evidence came from. When you learn to notice these qualities, you can rate sources with discipline rather than intuition. Internal sources deserve special attention because beginners sometimes assume internal equals reliable, but that is not always true. An internal log can be very strong evidence of an event, but it can also be misleading if the logging is incomplete, if timestamps are wrong, or if an automated system misclassifies behavior. Internal sensors can also have blind spots, like missing visibility for certain network segments or certain types of activity. A disciplined approach treats internal evidence as anchored in observation, but still asks whether that observation is complete and correctly interpreted. For example, seeing a connection attempt might be certain, but what that attempt means can still be uncertain without additional context. Internal evidence becomes much stronger when you can corroborate it across independent internal sources, like seeing related activity in multiple systems. The key is to respect internal telemetry without assuming it is perfect. External sources also vary widely, and part of becoming skilled is learning to evaluate them without being impressed by branding or alarmed by urgent language. Some external sources are careful and evidence-driven, providing details that help you validate their claims against what you see internally. Others are more like commentary, repeating what others said or presenting hypotheses as if they were proven facts. A disciplined evaluator looks for signs of primary sourcing, meaning the publisher directly observed something, obtained artifacts, or performed analysis, rather than only repeating secondhand information. You also look for specificity, like concrete indicators, clear timelines, or described methodology, while remembering that specificity can be faked if it is not verifiable. Another factor is timeliness, because older reporting might still be useful for pattern recognition, but might be less reliable for current infrastructure details. When you rate external sources with these lenses, you become less vulnerable to being swept up by popular narratives. Now we need to talk about evidence itself, because even a reliable source can present weak evidence for a specific claim. Evidence strength depends on how directly it supports a conclusion and how hard it would be for that evidence to appear if the conclusion were false. Strong evidence tends to be observable, specific, and hard to explain away with common alternatives. Weak evidence tends to be indirect, ambiguous, or based on interpretation without supporting artifacts. For example, saying that an adversary is likely involved because the activity feels similar is much weaker than showing a set of behaviors that match a known pattern and are supported by multiple observations. Another dimension of strength is independence, because evidence from two different places is stronger than evidence that traces back to one original claim. If you see the same indicator repeated in multiple blogs, that might still be one piece of evidence if they all copied from the same initial report. Disciplined rating helps you avoid confusing repetition with corroboration. Corroboration is one of the most powerful concepts here, and it is worth making it feel concrete. Corroboration means that two or more independent sources support the same fact or the same conclusion in a way that reduces the chance of coincidence or shared error. Independence is the key word, because if the sources are not independent, you can get false confidence. A classic beginner mistake is to treat social amplification as corroboration, like assuming something is true because many people are talking about it. True corroboration might mean that an internal observation aligns with a separate internal systems observation, and also aligns with a careful external report that includes artifacts you can verify. When these align, your confidence can rise legitimately because the evidence is converging from different origins. If you cannot establish independence, you should treat the situation as less certain, even if it feels popular. This is a discipline that protects you from groupthink and from coordinated misinformation. It also helps to recognize that some evidence is easier to manipulate than other evidence, and that affects how you rate it. Adversaries can intentionally plant clues, reuse familiar patterns, or borrow infrastructure to create misdirection. That means an indicator by itself may be less trustworthy than a consistent set of behaviors observed over time, especially if the behaviors are costly for an adversary to fake. In other words, think about the effort required to create the evidence and the risk the adversary would take by doing so. Evidence that could be generated cheaply or accidentally should be weighted more cautiously. Evidence that reflects sustained access, consistent operational behavior, or multiple coordinated steps may be harder to fake and can be stronger. This perspective does not mean you assume deception everywhere, but it reminds you to consider adversary incentives and capabilities when judging evidence strength. Disciplined rating includes thinking about how the evidence could be wrong, not just how it could be right. Another key part of discipline is acknowledging uncertainty explicitly, rather than hiding it or apologizing for it. When you rate sources and evidence, you are essentially building a confidence picture, and that picture should inform how you speak and what you recommend. If the evidence is thin or mostly indirect, you can still provide value by explaining what you think is most likely and what additional evidence would change your mind. If the evidence is strong and corroborated, you can speak more firmly and make more decisive recommendations. Beginners often swing between two extremes, either speaking as if everything is certain or refusing to say anything unless it is proven beyond doubt. Disciplined rating allows a middle path where you communicate the strength of support and the remaining unknowns. This makes your intelligence more usable because stakeholders can act proportionally to the level of confidence. A practical habit that supports disciplined rating is to avoid blending facts and interpretations in the same breath, especially when you are summarizing. When you say something like "we observed suspicious behavior," you are already mixing observation with judgment, because suspicious is an interpretation. A more disciplined approach is to describe what was observed and then explain why it is concerning, which keeps the evidence and the inference separate. This is not about sounding academic. It is about preventing your own language from inflating certainty. The same applies to external reporting, where you should distinguish between what a report claims and what it demonstrates. When you build this habit, Your notes become clearer and your analysis becomes easier because you can see what is truly supported. Over time, this also makes it easier to review past work and understand why you believed something at the time. It is also important to rate evidence in relation to the specific question you are trying to answer, because evidence strength is contextual. A piece of information might be very strong for one question and weak for another. For example, an internal observation of a connection to a domain might be strong evidence that the domain was contacted, but weak evidence about who controlled the domain or what the intent was. A detailed external report might be strong evidence about a broad campaign pattern, but weak evidence about whether your organization is affected. Discipline means you do not give evidence a universal score in your mind. You ask how it supports the specific requirement. This prevents you from overusing a favorite source or overreacting to a compelling artifact. When you keep evidence tied to the question, your analysis stays focused and your collection becomes more targeted. As you grow, you will notice that disciplined rating changes how you spend your time because it naturally pushes you toward higher value work. You stop chasing low-quality claims just because they are exciting, and you start prioritizing corroboration and discriminator evidence, which are the details that help you choose between explanations. You also become more efficient because you learn what kinds of sources reliably produce usable information for your needs. That does not mean you ignore weaker sources entirely. It means you treat them as hints that require confirmation rather than as foundations for conclusions. This mindset is one of the best defenses against cognitive bias because it keeps your confidence proportional to what is actually supported. It also improves team trust because your peers can see that your conclusions are anchored in evidence quality rather than in personal certainty. As we wrap up, the central idea is that rating sources and evidence is not a separate administrative step. It is the heart of analytic discipline. You are constantly deciding what to believe, what to doubt, and what to test next, and those decisions determine whether your intelligence is accurate and useful. When you separate source reliability from information credibility, look for independence, weigh evidence strength rather than counting mentions, and communicate uncertainty honestly, you create work that others can rely on. That reliability matters because threat intelligence influences real actions, and actions have costs, so your conclusions must be defensible. With this foundation in place, you are ready for the next challenge, which is taking multiple sources and multiple signals and turning them into one coherent story that a stakeholder can understand and use. That synthesis is where disciplined ratings pay off, because you will know which threads can bear weight and which ones should remain tentative.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.